fine. That's fine. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, today is a Memorial Day. It's a day set aside for us to remember the price that was paid for America's freedom. Remember the sacrifice of human lives that was made to allow us to be experiencing this great country. And Father, I'm also ever mindful of the spread of Christianity. And I remember, Father, the different missionaries who were first to break through the lines of race, break through the lines of distance, break through the lines of cultures. People who gave up their lives to share the gospel of Christ with others. Lord, we believe that there is no other way to the Father except by Jesus Christ. And so these people committed to that cause gave themselves selflessly as an ever-standing testimony of your great love in reaching people around the world. God, this day we remember a lot, and we're thankful and pray that you bless our time as we study your word in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Well, last week we started in on a comparative religious study, and it's the Messiah or the messenger. The Messiah, of course, stands for Jesus Christ, and the messenger is the phrase that is given to Muhammad as the star of the Muslim faith. And so we were asking the question, which is right? Is it indeed the messianic messages through Jesus Christ, or is it Islam? I wanted us to remember that Islam had an auspicious beginning. Muhammad was born many years ago. His family itself was very fractured. 2 weeks before Muhammad was born, his father died. 2 years after he was born, his mother died. He was raised by a relative who died a few years after that, and then finally a fourth relative who raised him to maturity. Muhammad had several things that he believed were the truth, and the first one was that the legacy of God's covenant and the promises of God were given to the firstborn child of Abraham. And that firstborn child was not Isaac. And although as Christians and Jews, everyone attributes the entitlement going to Isaac, it's important to see that the Muslims make a legitimate claim that the firstborn child was Ishmael. And shouldn't the promise be his and his alone? The second thing that we talked about last week was, is the word Islam, does it mean peace? And I know that I pointed, the only reference I could really find that set the stage for that was a presidential talk in 2008 where the President of the United States expounded on the fact that Islam was from the root word salam, which is, of course, the Arabic word for peace. And then we debunked that because that's not the root. The root word for Islam is a different word, and this word means submission. And that, in fact, is what the word Islam means, submission. There is a book that was the culmination of all of the thinking of Muhammad. It's called the Quran, and something that I might have overlooked last time was the fact that Quran literally means the recitations. And so what was collected were the words of Muhammad. He couldn't read and he couldn't write. He was illiterate. But the things that he said were captured by the next generation, if you will, of people who were adhering to his faith. The Quran itself went under several modifications as different people kind of took it over, added different sayings to it, subtracted different sayings to it, and worked on it to get it to the form that we have today. Within the framework of the Quran, there are 109 verses that explicitly support violence for the furtherance of Islam. And that's just a fact. They're there. And so when someone says that it is a book solely of peace, that isn't true. Now, I know that the same could be said of the Old Testament. Has anyone read some of the stories in the Old Testament? I mean, there's some nasty, nasty kick-tail stories in there of things that happened. But I think the biggest point that we need to walk away with is that those days have gone. It was a point in time when God was having the conquest of the land of Canaan where we really see that being done. But those days have gone, and Christianity and Judaism have matured much since then. Islam still holds, certain factions of Islam still hold those 109 verses very, very dear to them. One of the problems with Islam from last week was that it's not a monolithic religion, meaning that there's not just one. There are actually 5 different sects of Islam. We're most familiar with the Sunnis, who were the Saudi Arabs, I guess would be the easiest group to identify with that. Shiite, which would be Iran. That would be the easiest one to identify with that, and then 3 others. There are 26 subgroups within these 5. So you can see that there's massive opportunity for multiple sources of information, interpretation, and execution of the Quran and of the Islamic faith. It's not unified by a long shot. There are 3 different elements to the Muslim faith. One is very much like Christianity. There's a secular element. And these tend to be very, very moderate. They're not going to go to the Quran, pull out those 109 violent verses and respond to those. They're not going to do that. They're secular. It's much the same, I guess, as a secular Christian. You come up to a secular Christian and say, would you pray for me? They might go, well, no, I'm not really. I mean, I'm a Christian, but I don't pray for people. You get what I'm saying? Secular is removed from active activity within the faith. There are moderate Muslims. And the moderate Muslims, remember I pulled up Queen Reina from Jordan, and she does not wear a veil. She's very striking as a person. She's very kind. She has a blog. She does Twitter. I mean, what else could you want? But she's a moderate Muslim, and she really advocates that position of peace. The secular and the moderate Muslims do favor nonviolence, but our problem resides in what is dubbed as the consistent Muslims. This is 17 to 25%. That may not sound like a lot, but remember we're dealing with 1.8 billion people. And I still can't do the math on that. How many people does that make available for being radicalized? And these people definitely will adhere to everything that is in the Quran, and they will jack up the term jihad to mean more than just a spiritual pilgrimage, which was its original intent. They will jack it up to mean an all-out war against anything that is not Islamic. The propagation of Islam is the core of their beliefs. They believe that the entire world needs to come under the caliphate, just one leader, one religious leader who rules over all. And they believe it to be the Islamic message that is the one to be adhered to. Remember, the word Islam means submission. And so they are willing to press people into submission to their religion. Conversion in Islam frequently means threat. You are suppressed into becoming a Muslim. The principle of taqiyya was one that we introduced last week, and this is where in the Quran it actually instructs that you can lie. There are certain times that you can lie. And you remember the story that I pulled out of the Old Testament that may have given root to this concept in the mind of Muhammad. And it was the story where Abraham has a beautiful wife. He travels down to Egypt, and he quickly becomes aware of the fact that she is not an asset in this environment, but could be something very detrimental, because if the higher-ups in Egypt saw her and wanted to marry her, and she was married to a man, well, the only way that they could marry her was to get rid of the husband. And so Abraham and Sarah came up with this conniving scheme where he said, tell everybody you're my sister. and that'll go well for us. So they did that. They went down and told everybody his sister. Sure enough, Pharaoh fell in love with her, marries her, and all of a sudden Pharaoh starts getting boils. His cattle are dying. Things are going really bad, and he's like, what on earth have I done? You ever had one of those days? Where all of a sudden everything you touch just flops on the ground, and you just go, what have I done? How have I sinned? And then the discussion came up with Abraham when he confessed, she's really my wife. And Pharaoh was like beside himself. Are you kidding me? I can't do this. Take her back, and so on and so forth. That exchange validated in the mind of Muhammad this taqiyya, which is you can lie about your faith if you're threatened, and you can lie to people if it will promote your faith. So in essence, I could stand up here as a political leader and I could say to you, I'm Christian. I could say that. And that would be something that would be not viewed as a sin within the Muslim faith if you were protecting yourself or perhaps helping the cause in some form or fashion. The principle of abrogation was the other principle that I rolled out last week, and this is the one that is this week we'll really take a hard look at because it's fascinating. This principle means that the latest information or the latest act is the dominant one. So that if there were things said within the framework of the Quran that started in the town of Mecca. You recall when Muhammad began his pilgrimage, if you will, he was in Mecca, and as he began having these visions in the year, my old age just caught up with me firmly and strung me out to dry. As Muhammad first began having these visions in 609, 610, he started meeting with a spiritual force. And it's very curious because in his own writings, he talks about this force having scared him. And Muhammad had married a woman who was 25 years his senior, but she was wealthy, so, money makes love fall right in place, I guess. And he married her, and she advised him not to worry, but he was going to a cave, and in this cave he was having these visions, and he was afraid that the creature that he was talking to, and this is Muhammad, he thought it was a jinn. What is a jinn? We get the word genie from it. It was a demon, a spiritual force. He thought that's what it was, but his wife convinced him that no, it was the angel Gabriel, and that's how it came down to us. I thought that was a fascinating little thing that occurred there. Well, anyway, in this process in Mecca, he was writing at a peaceful time in his life. And the beginning of the Quran has many sayings that you could embrace, especially a secular moderate would embrace. They're sayings that teach peace. They're sayings that teach love. They're sayings that I think as Christians we could cozy right up next to and not have any problem with. But Muhammad then goes from Mecca to Medina. It's a different area. The reason he did that was because there was some pushback in Mecca. The people in Mecca had this wicked cool, I can't remember what the name of it is, but you've seen it. You've all seen it. If you've ever seen any pictures of Islam, of Mecca, everybody is bowed down, and in the middle of a square is a big square building. That thing has been there for millennia. That building used to have all kinds of false gods and deities in it back in the day of Muhammad. It was polytheistic, the whole religion of the area. And the god that Muhammad favored was the moon god. And that was the god he called Allah. And so what Muhammad was advocating in Mecca was that get rid of the other deities. This is the guy. This is the one that you should, and I'm having these visions, I'm getting told this word. This is the way that we should be going. Well, the people of Mecca, curiously, story that absolutely parallels the Apostle Paul in Ephesus. I don't know if you remember your scriptures at all, but Paul got beat up in Ephesus really badly, and he got beat up by a silversmith. And the silversmith was an artist who made different sorts of coins and different sorts of amulets for people to worship their polytheistic gods with. And when Paul started preaching one God, that was like a real, this is going to wreck the economy. And so they beat the tar out of Paul and threw him out of Ephesus, tried to throw him out of Ephesus. Same thing happens with Muhammad. He advocates this one God, this moon God, and he's going to call him Allah, get rid of the other gods, and all the artisans, all the artists who are making all these really cool, necklaces and stuff with all the different polytheistic gods, and they're having these huge groups of people come all year round to Mecca to buy all this stuff. They didn't think anything of him coming up with this one God thought. So they bounced him out of Mecca. He went to Medina. In Medina, he struggled. In Medina, he had followers, but he had to fight battles in Medina. One of the first battles he ever fought was there. And he became much more aggressive, much more of a military lord. And so his sayings from this period of time are a lot more hostile. Those 109 nasty verses come from this Medina period. Well, now, in Islam today, if you are a secular moderate, you favor the early scriptures of the Quran because they are filled with compassion and things like that. But if you are a consistent Muslim, you favor the latter ones because they are filled with, we take over the world. They are filled with violence. They are filled with, infidels. They are filled with cut their heads off, literally, as the standard program for eliminating an infidel is to removal of the head in the Quran. And that side of the ledger would be more appealing to a consistent Muslim today. So there clearly are these two different paths. It clearly is difficult for Islamic people, even today, to be able to bring a unified front, a monolithic front to their religion. They cannot. And the problem is that the consistent Muslims are using the Quran. So it's not like you can say you're not being biblical. They are actually using verses in the Quran, which negates the ability of the moderate and the secular Muslims to really quell them. They won't do it. Their imams won't do it. They won't comment against what is going on. And even though it's a smaller population, even though the consistents are 15 to 25% of the population, 17 to 25% of the population, do you know how many people were actually Nazis in World War II? About 12% of the German population. That just kind of puts it in perspective for you that a minority can drive the cart. They can drive the thing. Well, in the principle of abrogation, what I was getting at was that the latter verses override the earlier verses. So the principle of abrogation simply means that the latest thing I say overrides the thing I said before. I'm sure as a dad, you've used this mic. You tell your kids, all right, guys, if you're going to be good, you can get in the car and go with me. And suddenly they do something you don't think is good. Well, you can't go. Well, you said we could. There it is right there. There's the principle playing itself out. And you say, no, this is my last judgment, and my last one overrides all previous ones. This becomes important because now as we're arguing over which part of the Quran do we adhere to, the Mecca verses or the Medina verses, the Medina verses are the last verses. So there is a point to be made that they are the ones that we believe in. We have this Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail that everyone is fighting about is the blessing of God to Abraham. Let's say this together, read it together. The Lord, go. An incredible act of faith. Abram is told to uproot everything that he has, travel in a strange land that God is going to show him. And these are the covenant promises that God gives him. Let's read them together. I will. How many guys in this room actually got their wife using a phrase like that? I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. Not many. All right. Next one. I will bless those. Now, if this is God speaking to you, this is some pretty heavy-duty stuff. I'm going to make you a great nation. Whoever you bless will be blessed. Whoever you curse will be cursed. That's power. That's incredible power. And finally, to your... Now, the land is Canaan. The land is current-day Israel. It's that region right there. That is the land that is being talked about. It's the Holy Grail. And Judaism's challenge to Ishmael and the Abrahamic covenant comes here. We remember that Hagar, when she became part of a plan that Sarah hatched. Sarah was Abraham's wife. Sarah could not have any children. She was probably 80 years old, moving right along in time. Exactly 80 years old, moving right along in time. And she knew that Abraham had no heirs, and she knew that God had given Abraham this incredible promise, this blessing. And the only way that that blessing could be actualized would be if he had heirs. How are you going to have descendants like the sand on the seashore? How are you going to have descendants like the stars in the heaven if you don't have an heir? You need to have an heir. And she couldn't bear any children. In her frustration, pain, and what she thought was an excellent decision, she said, Look, take my slave, make her your concubine, have a baby with her, and maybe I can raise a generation up through that. Remember my warning, gentlemen. If your wife comes to you, offers you her slave, do not sleep with this woman, because nothing but pain resulted from this one act. And Sarah became angry with Hagar. She obviously had to have had incredibly convoluted feelings to have this slave, boom, get pregnant. And it's like, oh, thanks, God. And now everything. So she gets angry with her, chases her off. An angel of the Lord goes to Hagar, finds her, says to go back to your mistress, submit to her. And then the angel gives her a blessing. Let's read it together. I will. Does that not sound like one of the three blessings that God gave to Abraham? Does it not sound like that? And so the argument from an Islamic perspective is, look, he's the firstborn male child. Look, the promise has been given to him. And then the angel continued on and said to her, I'm going to give you a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. And then look at these attributes of this son named Ishmael. Let's read this one together. He will be... What's a wild donkey? You ever been around a wild donkey? Everybody seen a wild donkey? They can be snorky. They bite really, really hard. They kick. They're nasty, nasty little critters. Not the sort of thing you want to snuggle up to in any way, shape, or manner. He will be, this is a description of what Ishmael's descendants with wild donkeys. They're going to be really hard to be around. Read the rest of it. And everybody... He will live in... What an apt description of what I perceive the Middle East is today. I mean, if you go to chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, it's called the Table of Nations, and it shows the division of two different groups of people. Those that followed God, beginning with Noah and coming down through, and those that left God coming down through. And Ishmael seems to fall into this category. In Genesis 17:16, we have a blessing being issued now to the second child. As you know the story, Sarah was 80 years old. Time goes on. In chapter 17, we have visitors. The three angels show up at the Mirama oak tree. and they talk with Abraham, and he feeds them, and they give an announcement to him, and they said, this time next year, your wife will be pregnant. And remember, she was listening. Not that women do that, but I mean, she was listening. She had a little glass up on the door, and she was listening to the conversation. And when she heard that, come on, 80 years old. Anybody here 50? Anybody here 40? 50? 60? Oh my gosh. Yeah, we're not going any higher than that. But the point is, you become very aware of the fact that there are limitations to your physical stamina at these ages, and she was quite obviously not going to have a baby. So she laughed. And you recall that these three visitors, why'd you laugh? And they went into that real awkward little and she's lying, and they know it, and it's horrible. It's a horrible exchange. But from that comes this blessing. And Abraham said to God, now look, this is Abraham trying to reason with God. He has a boy son. And you got to believe that he was loving on Ishmael. You got to believe, Ishmael's 14 years old at this point. You got to believe that he's loving on him, that he's hanging out with him. And Abraham says to God, look, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. In other words, the promise that you gave to me, give to Ishmael. Let him be the recipient of the blessing. But very specifically, God responds in this matter. Then God said. Those are the same words that are in the book of Genesis with the creation. And God said. So this is an emphatic statement. Sarah will bear you a son. You will call his name Isaac. I will, what? Could it be any clearer? An everlasting covenant. So it's not like this is going to be for 15, 20 minutes or until he dies. Everlasting covenant. And not just for him, but for who? All of his descendants after him. And then very specifically, God says, and as for Ishmael, I've heard you, and I will surely bless him and make him a great nation. So it's not like Ishmael was just thrown out to pasture and would have nothing. He'd be given the right as a son of Abram to have a nation. But the covenant blessing of God was going to be on Isaac. My covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you. Can you not see the tension in the Middle East suddenly coming up on the screen very clearly? We have the Muslim world with Ishmael, who says he was first child, he's first male, he gets the blessing. And then we have the nation of Israel saying that's not how God operates. God chooses those who he will call to him. And that principle is really important for us who are Gentiles, because we were never part of the programming of God, other than the fact through Jesus Christ, God chooses us. And the Apostle Paul talks about that so graphically in the book of Romans. Paul says it was by faith Abraham was deemed to him as righteousness. It was by faith that he went to this foreign land. By faith he believed in the covenant promises. By faith he received from God. And by faith is how you come to a relationship with God, through belief in Jesus Christ. Very strong pattern being established there. So the covenant promise for the Jews is Isaac. He got the covenant, and they are descendants of him. It's hard to argue, because when you look at Ishmael and Isaac, Ishmael disappears from Scripture. We don't get references to him anymore, other than in remote list of names. He disappears from Scripture. Isaac, on the other hand, becomes the dominant theme. Out of Isaac comes Jacob. And look again at the process. Who is the firstborn son? Esau. Who is the child of promise? Yeah. The last shall be first. And so we have Jacob, who then becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Does that not look a whole lot like Israel when I put it up on the screen there? And that's the land that everybody's fighting over. And this is the Abrahamic covenant that everybody is yabbering that they owned. And this is what Muhammad zeroed in on, is that Ishmael should be the recipient of that covenant. Well, to give you a timeline, because I know that I'm rotten with this stuff, and I suspect one or two of you are too, Judaism begins in like 2000 BC. That's where we believe that Abraham first had this contact with God and the ball begins to bounce. Hinduism, to put it in perspective, was 1500 BC, about 500 years after that. Buddhism was 525 BC, and it's a modified Hinduism. Christianity arrives on the screen at about 32 AD, the death of Christ, somewhere between 31 and 33 AD, depending on Herod's date, BC. And then Islam. 622 AD was the official starting date of Islam, the official starting date. It's a Johnny-come-lately religion. It's the new kid on the block by thousands of years. And so if there's any value in that, you're staring at it. But don't forget that in Islam there's a principle. And the principle is the principle of abrogation. And the principle of abrogation says that the last shall be first. The principle of abrogation says that Islam is the corrective religion. It corrects all of the other religions, and it is the sole monotheistic belief of God. That is their position. Now, one of the things that we crash into all the time when I'm talking with anyone, it seems like Christianity has these really bad points. The Crusades, they were pretty bad. The Spanish Inquisition, that was pretty gnarly. Was there anything else that we did that was really dumb? Sure there were, but those two really jump off the page. The Crusades in particular have always come up on the screen when we're talking about the Muslim world, because people who are advocates of Islam or people who are just trying to be, moderate and try to keep peace amongst everybody, they will say that Christians started this mess. You had Manchester, England this past week because of the Crusades. They started this mess. That position has been picked up in popular teaching. Not that there's ever any trouble on our college campuses or the professors lead people astray, but here's a direct quote from Georgetown University professor. I'm sorry, his last name's Esposito. It just worked out that way. I tried to change the spelling. An imperial papal power play. This is what he asserts. This is what this professor teaches. It was an imperial papal power play. Papal is the Pope. And so what he's saying is that it was the Pope. The Pope had a power play, led to century-long series of holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam. Now, what he's advocating is that Pope Urban II, of course, who was the Pope who issued the First Crusade, the declaration for the First Crusade, Pope Urban II had in mind, according to John Esposito, this concept of taking over the world and getting all kinds of money and power, et cetera, et cetera. It was a power play. Christendom against Islam and left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. So clearly the professor at Georgetown University puts the onus of this on Christians. And it was the Pope that started this whole mess. I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of jihad, because an Islamic person will say that jihad clearly only means, and it means this, the word struggle. And they will say that it is actually a meditative phrase. It's actually a spiritual phrase. Jihad means to go to a monastery and to struggle with your faith. Jihad means to struggle in prayer. Jihad means to struggle in fasting. Jihad is spiritual in its nature. And that was the intent of jihad. Unless you are a consistent Muslim, then you add a second meaning. Jihad becomes a military struggle too, because it's religious in nature. If you can struggle in prayer for Islam to become the dominant religion, doesn't it make sense that you should also jihad physically to make Islam the dominant religion? It was a small step for them to make. Military jihad is required, so it says, against others. It can be performed using anything from legal, diplomatic, and economic or political measures. Now, this is a meaning for jihad. You can advance the cause using anything, legal, diplomatic, economic, political means. If there is no peaceful alternative, Islam also allows force. But there are strict rules to force. What are the rules? Can you read the first one? I pulled that definition right off the Supreme Islam Council site of America. I pulled it right off. And as I read it, those words were very, very shallow in the wake of Manchester and little girls blown to pieces by an Islamic. So jihad is not a peaceful venture into convincing people that Islam's a good thing. Jihad has grown into a spiritual battle, but it's now militant. And so a jihadist believes that as they go into their own self-destruction, what they are doing is bringing to Allah everyone that they kill. They're bringing these people to Allah as little notches on their belt. They themselves, it's been argued back and forth, but they themselves believe that they receive eternal reward in heaven. And in some cases, that can be virgins. They believe that they receive these things if they kill themselves. That's where jihad has gone. I want to just run through a little bit of a history of what the Islamic nature, at least Muhammad's nature, had been in early centuries. And I think you'll find this surprising, given the fact that the professor from Johns Hopkins University clearly states that it was the Pope who started and instigated this entire mess in 1095. I'm back at 627 AD. The Battle of Medina Trench, Muhammad decapitates 800 Jews. He conquers and decapitates them. 632, Jerusalem is sacked, and every Jew in Jerusalem was annihilated, killed. 640 AD, Alexandria. And you may not realize this, but these are cities of Christendom. Alexandria, Nicene, Antioch. Antioch, of course, was where Barnabas and Paul first went up and did their ministry. Alexandria, Nicene, Antioch, Jerusalem. These are all centers of Christianity where these confrontations are occurring. And in Alexandria, one of the descendants of Muhammad's military strength, because Muhammad had died, of course, in 632, killed 12,000 people in Alexandria, slaughtered them. 643, the island of Nakios. And I didn't realize this, but the Muslims had a navy. Go figure. I always thought that they were like relegated to camels. Not at all. They had a very powerful navy that brought a lot of fear and devastation to the Middle East. And on the island of Nakios, they were sacked by Amariz, the undefended city. The soldiers had actually run away. And the graphic portrayal of this battle by him says that the blood was knee-deep in the city. 1093. Still, this is all still before the Pope responds, mind you. This is all still before the Pope responds. 8,000 people beheaded in Nicene. And then in 1095, there's a cry for help from Emperor Alexis I. He sends a delegation to Rome. He asks the Pope for help. And in March 1095, he begins the process of sending the first crusade. The crusades began as a defensive position. And that's history. So when somebody comes up to you and just kind of throws that out in your lap, you can say there were 9 crusades. I'm not saying that atrocities weren't committed. They absolutely were. But that was the nature of the war at this time. That was the nature of payback. It was a horrible setting. Now, again, I just want to help you get this. There were 16 crusade battles that were fought. 3 up here in Turkey, several in Syria. We moved down, of course, Jerusalem, Nicene, Antioch, these places, Alexandria, Egypt. There were 16 battles fought in the 9 crusades. 16 battles. I'm going to show you a map now of the Islamic attacks in that same region. There were 548 Islamic battles where they were taking over the known area for the propagation of Islam. It's pretty obvious that for them, military advancement is part of their theology. It's part of what they do. So as we conclude today, and I do want to wrap this up for us, the covenant promise is issued to Ishmael or Isaac. That's the tension, and it's really important that you see that. But of course, a powerful set of verses from Genesis 17, where God says specifically to Abraham that I will bless Ishmael. He will be allowed to be a great nation, but my covenant promise will reside with Isaac. That's huge. That is the whole crux of the issue and of the matter. The violence is supported for both purging and conversion in the Quran. So this is not something that they cannot use. This is not something that they are directly spoken against. Now, I have had difficulty on Memorial Day as a Christian because there are a lot of Christians who died defending this country, and we are the recipients of the benefit of that. But if I take the words of Jesus Christ out of the New Testament, and if I'm Judge Gorsuch, I just read you the passages. I'm not interpreting a thing. Jesus says, don't yield the sword. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Jesus says, pray for your enemies. Pray for those who bless those who persecute you. He absolutely says a lot of things that could be construed as pacifists. A lot of things. And so Christianity is very different from the teachings of Islam, very different from the teachings in the Quran, in that they do have this large group of scriptures that talk about following the path of love. Now, I also know that as a Christian American and all those things, there have been times when we've defended the undefendable. We've been very proactive. And, it just gets complicated in our theology. I'm not going to go into it today. But again, it's Memorial Day. And if I was up here preaching on that, I'd have to deal with those tensions. Well, the point is that Christianity advocates love and a different modality for bringing people into the faith. Islam is all about threat and torture. Threat and torture. You have three options when you're confronted by an Islamic army. You have three options. You can convert to Islam. You can become an infidel that is allowed to live within their ranks if you pay a tax. Or you're beheaded if you insist on proclaiming that Jesus Christ is the only God. If you'll confess all of it, they'll let you hang out. If not, they'll cut your head off. As the end times grow near, the Bible predicts the emergence of terror, now we associate it with Islam. But I'm sure that's not going to be the last place where terror confronts us in these final days. We must both stand for and share our faith through prayer of our enemies and through the presentation of the good news. That's where we have to stand. So as we take a look at these two comparative religions, I'm not going to hang out with Islam anymore. I thought a couple weeks of it just to bring you up to battle speed would be good enough. We'll be moving along now. But I hope it's been informative to you, and I hope that it's given you some biblical basis for why these tensions exist. And I hope that we've set the record straight in a couple areas where I really feel that there's been deficiency in education and understanding. Thank you for letting me teach you this morning.